The name was written in the dust on an old fence post at the edge of nowhere, and the moment Robert Warren saw it, his whole chest caved in like something enormous had just passed through him without asking permission. He had been riding since before dawn, pushing his roan mare through the dry flatlands of eastern New Mexico territory in the summer of 1882, trailing a small herd of cattle that belonged to his employer, a man named Hector Grimes, who ran one of the bigger spreads outside the town of Cimarron. Robert was 26 years old, broad in the shoulder, lean everywhere else, with hands so calloused from rope work that he could press them flat against a branding iron for a second or two before the heat reached him. He was not a man who believed in signs or portents. He was not a man who read poetry or wept at sunsets or thought too hard about the nature of his own heart. He rode, he worked, he ate, he slept, and occasionally on a Saturday evening he played cards at the saloon in Cimarron and drank 2 glasses of whiskey, never 3. And yet when he saw the name scratched into the gray, weathered wood of that old fence post Louise Brooks, something unfolded inside him that he could not explain and did not know how to fold back up again. He pulled his mare to a stop and just sat there in the saddle, one hand resting on his thigh, the other loose on the reins. The cattle drifted on without him, indifferent. The morning sun was already hammering down on the New Mexico scrubland, and the air smelled of sage and red dust, and the distant possibility of rain that would never actually come. The fence post was one of dozens running along the edge of an old property line, most of the wire between them sagging or broken entirely, and this particular post was cracked halfway through and leaning at a sharp angle like it was tired of standing. Someone had etched the name with what looked like the tip of a knife, pressing deep enough that even the wind and weather had not erased it entirely, though the letters had softened at their edges, suggesting the carving was not recent. Louise Brooks. He did not know any Louise Brooks. He had never met a Louise Brooks, could not recall ever hearing the name spoken aloud. There was nothing about it that should have meant a single thing to him. He was a cowboy in the middle of a vast, indifferent landscape, and this was someone else's name scratched into someone else's fence post for reasons that were none of his business. And yet his throat went tight, and his heart knocked twice against his ribs in a way it almost never did, and he sat there for a long, foolish moment before he clicked his tongue at the mare and rode on to catch up with the cattle, carrying the name with him like a stone he had picked up off the ground and could not bring himself to set back down. He did not think about it again until that night, when he sat by the small fire he had built to keep the coyotes at a distance, eating salt pork and hard biscuit and watching the stars come out over New Mexico one by one. Then the name drifted up from wherever he had packed it away and settled in front of him in the firelight, and he turned it over in his mind the way a man might turn over a coin he could not identify, examining both sides, feeling the weight of it, finding no satisfactory answer. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself he was tired and sun-baked and prone to foolishness in that condition. He rolled up in his bedroll and went to sleep and dreamed of a woman with dark hair standing in the wind on an open plain, her face turned away from him, her name written in the dust at her feet. He woke before the stars had fully faded and lay still for a moment, staring up at the sky, and said the name quietly to himself just once, testing the way it sat in his mouth. Then he got up, saddled the mare, and got back to work. He delivered the cattle 3 days later to a man named Pedersen who had a homestead ranch south of Wagon Mound, and on the ride back to Cimarron, he passed within a mile of that fence post again. He did not stop. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. But he felt the pull of it, unmistakable and irritating like a splinter working its way under a thumbnail. When he got back to Grimes' spread, he unsaddled the mare, rubbed her down, forked hay into her stall, and then walked to the bunkhouse where 4 other hands were playing cards in the lamplight. He sat down on his bunk, pulled off his boots, and looked at the ceiling. "You all right?" said a hand named Del Carver, who was 60 years old and had been riding ranges since before Robert was born. Dell had a white mustache and eyes the color of old denim and a way of watching people that missed nothing. "Fine," Robert said. "You got the look of a man who is not fine." "Dell, I am fine." Dell went back to his cards. Robert lay back and stared at the ceiling and thought about the name, and that night he decided something that surprised him with its firmness. He was going to find out who Louise Brooks was. Not because he had to, and not because it made any logical sense. Just because he could not stop thinking about it, and the only way he had ever known to stop thinking about a thing was to understand it. The next morning he rode into Cimarron proper and stopped at the dry goods store, where the owner, a heavy-set man named Caldwell, knew everyone within 40 miles and served as an unofficial repository of local information. "Louise Brooks," Caldwell said, looking up from the counter where he was weighing out coffee beans. He pulled the name around in his mouth for a moment. "Can't say the name is familiar to me. Where'd you hear it?" "Saw it carved on a fence post," Robert said, and felt immediately foolish saying it out loud. "Out near the Pedersen Road. Old fence, mostly fallen." Caldwell squinted. "That old property line out there used to belong to a family named Collier back in the early 70s. Don't know any Brooks connected to it." He paused, drumming his thick fingers on the counter. "You might ask over at the post office. Martha keeps track of who gets mail, who moves in, who moves out." Robert thanked him and walked down the dusty main street of Cimarron to the post office, which was a small adobe building wedged between the barber and a bootmaker. Inside, a thin woman with sharp eyes and gray-streaked hair looked up from behind the counter. "Brooks," she repeated when he asked. "Let me think on that." She was quiet for a moment, pressing one finger against her lips. "There's a homestead about 12 miles south and east of here, closer to the Rayado Creek. Belongs to a man named Henry Brooks, widower. He's got a daughter." She paused and something careful crossed her face. "She came back about 2 months ago. Came back from somewhere east, I think. She'd been gone several years." "What's the daughter's name?" Robert asked. The postmistress looked at him with the particular look that small-town women give to men who ask questions about young women they do not yet know. "Louise," she said. Robert nodded slowly and thanked her and walked back out into the white heat of the Cimarron morning. He stood on the wooden sidewalk with his hat in his hands and looked out at the street and thought about what he was going to do next, which logically should have been nothing at all, because he had no reason and no business and no invitation. He rode south and east. The Brooks homestead was smaller than he had expected. A modest adobe house set in a fold of land near a thin line of cottonwood trees that marked the course of the Rayado Creek. There was a kitchen garden to one side of the house, and a small barn behind it, and several chickens scratching in the yard. A man who looked to be in his early 60s was mending something near the barn door, bent over his work with the absorbed concentration of someone who did not have money to waste materials. He straightened when he heard the horse. He was a weathered man, thinned by years of dry farming, with a gray beard and a direct look that was not unfriendly but was not immediately warm either. "Help you?" he called. Robert rode up to within conversational distance and touched his hat brim. "Good morning. My name is Robert Warren. I work for Hector Grimes over north of Cimarron. I'm sorry to come calling without notice. I was wondering if this was the Brooks place." "It is," the man said. "I'm Henry Brooks." "Yes, sir. I heard you might have a daughter. I know this is going to sound unusual and I apologize for that in advance. But I came across a name carved on a fence post out on the old Collier property road. And—" He stopped, because at that moment the door of the adobe house opened and a woman stepped out into the sunlight, wiping her hands on the front of her apron, and Robert Warren lost every single word he had been preparing to say. She was 23 years old, he would learn later, with dark hair pinned up loosely in the way women managed their hair in the heat of New Mexico summer, and dark brown eyes that caught the light with an intelligence that was immediately apparent and somewhat unsettling. She was not tall, but she carried herself as though she had decided at some point in her life that the space she occupied was exactly the right amount of space, and she would not diminish it for anyone. She had a dusting of freckles across the bridge of her nose from years of sun, and a firm, expressive mouth, and she looked at Robert Warren sitting on his horse in her father's yard with the unhurried, evaluating gaze of someone who had learned to take her time with first impressions. "Who is this?" she said to her father. "Says his name is Robert Warren," Henry Brooks said, not unkindly. "Says he found your name carved on a fence post." Louise Brooks tilted her head. "Which fence post?" Robert cleared his throat. "Out on the Collier property road. Old fence leaning. Your name's carved into one of the posts. Louise Brooks in capital letters." Something changed in her expression. The evaluating look softened into something else, something more private, and she looked away from him for a moment toward the line of cottonwoods along the creek. Then she looked back. "Come down off your horse," she said. "I'll get some water. You must be baked through, riding out here this time of day." It was not exactly a warm welcome, and it was not exactly a cold one. It was practical, which Robert would come to understand was fundamentally who Louise Brooks was. She was a deeply practical woman who had emotions as large and serious as the New Mexico sky, but she expressed them practically, in the way she poured a glass of water, or handed a man a plate of food, or fixed something that was broken before anyone had asked her to fix it. He sat on the porch steps with a tin cup of water, and Henry Brooks settled in a chair nearby, and Louise sat on the railing with her back to the post, looking at him with those steady dark eyes, and Robert told them the story of seeing the name, the whole honest foolish thing of it, how it had stopped him cold and he could not explain why and could not stop thinking about it, and he thought they would laugh at him or send him away, but neither of them did. "I carved that name," Louise said when he finished. "5 years ago, before I left for St. Louis." "Why?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, and the sound of the creek and the chickens and the dry wind filled the silence before she answered. "My mother had just died," she said simply. "We used to walk out to that fence, she and I, when I was a girl. She said she liked to walk to the edge of the property and back because it made her feel like the land was hers, all the way to the boundary." She paused. "When she passed, I went out there one evening and I carved my name in that post because I did not know who I was going to be without her, and I thought if I could at least put my name somewhere permanent, I could find my way back to myself." The afternoon was very quiet. Robert Warren held his tin cup in both hands and felt something enormous in his chest, a tenderness that he had not chosen and did not know what to do with. "Did you," he asked, "find your way back?" She looked at him for a long moment, and the ghost of something that was almost a smile crossed her mouth. "I'm still working on it," she said. He rode back to Grimes Spread that evening with the feeling of a man who has fallen off a horse, checked himself over for broken bones, found none, and then realized with dawning astonishment that the fall has actually deposited him somewhere better than where he started. He came back the following Sunday. He told himself he was riding that direction anyway, and that stopping was merely polite. He was lying to himself with an enthusiasm that would have been impressive if he had been watching himself from the outside. He brought nothing with him because he could not think of what to bring, and he arrived to find Louise in the kitchen garden pulling weeds in the merciless midday heat, her sleeves rolled to her elbows and her hair damp at the temples. She looked up when she heard the horse, shielded her eyes against the sun, and said, "You again." "Me again," he agreed and dismounted. She sat back on her heels and looked at him with that steady, evaluating gaze. "Did you want something, Mr. Warren, or are you the kind of man who just rides around visiting people for no particular reason?" "I wanted to see if you were all right," he said, which was not something he had planned to say. "After what you told me about your mother and the fence post, I thought about it all week." Something in her expression shifted very slightly, the way the light shifts on a plane when a cloud moves past the sun. "That was kind of you," she said. "I'm all right. I've had 5 years to work on being all right." She stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. "My father is at the neighbor's place helping with a roof repair. I was about to stop for a meal if you want to eat something." He ate something. He ate beans and cornbread and a cup of strong coffee, sitting at the small wooden table in the adobe house while Louise sat across from him and asked him questions about himself with a directness that he found alternately disarming and bracing. Where had he grown up? Missouri, near Independence. Had he always worked with cattle? Since he was 15 when his father died and he needed to earn money. Did he like it? He thought about that question more carefully than it might have seemed to deserve, because she was watching him with the air of someone who would notice if he gave her an easy answer rather than a true one. "I like the space," he said finally. "I like being outside in it. I don't know that I love cattle specifically. I love the work of moving through that kind of country on horseback, reading the land, knowing where the water is and where the grass runs out. That part I love." She nodded slowly. "That's an honest answer." "What about you?" he said. "St. Louis, what did you do there?" "I worked in a millinery shop," she said. "Making hats." She said it without apology or embarrassment, but also without warmth for the subject. "I was good at it, and the woman who owned the shop was decent to me, and I saved money, and it was a life. But it wasn't this." She glanced toward the window, through which the dusty yard and the cottonwood trees and the long open rise of the land beyond were visible. "I came back when my father wrote to say his health was failing, but truthfully, I think I would have come back before long regardless." "You missed it," he said. "Terribly," she said, and the single word was so unguarded and so plain that Robert felt it like something physical, like sunlight coming through a cloud directly onto the back of his neck. He left before sundown, because it was not appropriate to stay later without Henry Brooks present, and he had not yet met the father fully enough to know if he was welcome beyond the basic hospitality Louise offered everyone. But when he was in the saddle and his mare had turned her nose toward the north, Louise came to the gate and stood with her hand on the post. "Mr. Warren," she said. He looked back. "I don't know what made you ride all the way out here just because you saw a name in the dust," she said, "but I find I'm glad you did." He could not think of a single thing to say that would be adequate, so he touched his hat brim and rode north, carrying that sentence with him like a lantern someone had placed in his hands. Henry Brooks was a complicated figure in the story of Robert and Louise, though he was not a villain and never became one. He was a man shaped by hard decades of dry farming in country that did not easily yield, a man who had loved his wife deeply and lost her and been diminished by the loss in ways he was only slowly recovering from. When Louise had returned from St. Louis, something in him had straightened again, as though her presence reminded him of what he was doing all this for. He was protective of her in the blunt, unaffected way of men of his generation, not possessive but watchful, and he took his time deciding what he thought of Robert Warren. Robert came back the following Sunday and the Sunday after that. He always arrived at a decent hour and left at a decent hour and addressed Henry with the respectful formality the man's age and position deserved. He helped without being asked, fixed a loose board on the barn door one afternoon, spent another helping Henry replace a section of fence around the kitchen garden, worked without complaint in the heat, and went home sweated through without mentioning it. He did not touch Louise, and he did not say things to her in front of her father that he would not have said in front of anyone. He simply came, every week steadily, the way water comes down a creek in the spring, unhurrying but constant. Louise, for her part, was not indifferent to any of it. She simply did not make it easy, and she did not make it easy for reasons that were entirely her own and entirely reasonable. She had left this country because her mother died, and she did not know who she was anymore, and she had spent 5 years in a city making hats and learning the shape of her own life, and she had come back. She had not come back in order to immediately hand her life to another person. She was careful with her heart in the way that people are careful with things that have been broken before and repaired but not entirely forgotten. She asked him hard questions. She asked them conversationally, without accusation, but they were hard. What did he want his life to look like in 10 years? Did he intend to work for other men forever, or did he have his own plans? What did he believe was owed between a man and a woman who lived their life together? She did not ask these things to trap him or to test him in some formal way. She asked them because she was 23 years old and she had thought carefully about the shape of her own life, and she needed to know whether his thoughts on the same subject were compatible with hers. He answered her honestly every time, even when the honest answer was uncomfortable. Yes, he wanted his own land eventually. He had saved a fair amount over the years and was working towards something of his own. He did not know exactly what form it would take yet. What he believed was owed between two people who had chosen each other was honesty, full and undiminished, even when it was inconvenient, especially when it was inconvenient. He had seen enough of the alternative to know what it produced. She listened to every answer with that steady attention she gave to everything. And then one afternoon in late August, when they had been sitting on the porch after supper watching the sun go down behind the western mesas, she said, without looking at him, "I think I'm starting to like you considerably, Robert Warren." He sat with that for a moment, feeling the warmth of it spread through him like the last light spreading across the land in front of them. "Only starting to," he said. She looked at him sideways, and the ghost of a smile was not a ghost anymore. It was a full, real, slightly reluctant smile, which on Louise Brooks was more valuable than effusive smiles from most other people. "I have been at it for a while," she admitted, "but I thought I ought to tell you now before it got any further along." He looked at her in the evening light, her profile serious and beautiful against the fading sky, and he felt what he had first felt standing at that fence post translated now into something warmer and fuller and immeasurably more real. That nameless thing he could not explain had a name now, or it was in the process of getting one. It had a face and dark eyes, and flour on its hands from the bread it had been making that afternoon, and a habit of tilting its head slightly to the left when it was thinking hard about something. "Louise," he said. She turned to look at him fully. "I rode 12 miles out into the desert because I saw your name written in the dust on a fence post," he said. "I think you should understand that I am not a man who does things like that. I have never done anything like that in my life. And if that tells you anything about how I feel, then I think we're past starting and well into something else." She looked at him for a long, serious moment. Then she reached over and put her hand on top of his where it rested on the porch railing, and the warmth of her palm against the back of his hand was so simple and so enormous that Robert Warren felt it in the base of his spine. "All right," she said quietly. "Something else then." Henry Brooks watched all of this unfold with the experienced patience of a man who has raised a daughter and knows that the worst thing he can do is make her feel watched. He said nothing directly to either of them for several weeks. He simply observed, the way he observed weather or the behavior of the creek in dry season, gathering information before drawing conclusions. One evening in early September, after Louise had gone inside to finish some sewing by the lamp, he and Robert sat on the porch together in the blue dark, and Henry said without preamble, "What are your intentions toward my daughter?" Robert said, "Entirely honorable and serious, sir." Henry was quiet for a moment. "She was hurt," he said, "not by a man, by the leaving and the coming back and everything that happened in between. She is stronger than most people, my Louise, but that does not mean she is not breakable." "I know that," Robert said. "I would rather break my own arm than be the cause of any hurt to her." Henry was quiet again for a longer moment. Then he said, "All right," in exactly the same way that Louise had said it on the porch that evening, and Robert understood that they were, in some fundamental way, the same sort of people. September unfolded into October, and October in New Mexico territory meant mornings so cold you could see your breath and afternoons that retained enough warmth to work comfortably in. Robert drove cattle, fixed fences, and spent every Sunday at the Brooks place. Louise drove into Cimarron on some of those Sundays with him, sitting beside him in the small wagon he borrowed from Grimes' spread, and they would do her errands at Caldwell's Dry Goods and then sit in the small cafe on the main street and drink coffee and talk for an hour before heading back. She told him things, not all at once, but slowly, the way the creek releases its water, measured and true. She told him about her mother's final illness, swift and merciless typhoid fever that had taken Louise Brooks in 10 days in the spring of 1877. She told him about arriving in St. Louis with $60 and a single trunk, and the woman at the millinery, Mrs. Clara Ames, who had looked at her hands and said, "You have capable hands. I can work with capable hands." She told him about the loneliness of a city when you are from the open country, the way the buildings press in on all sides and the sky disappears except in small rectangular pieces overhead, and how she had sometimes gone to a park on her half-day off and sat on a bench looking at the sky above the treetops just to give herself the illusion of space. In return, he told her about Missouri, about his father who had been a blacksmith of some reputation, and a man of quiet warmth who had died of a fever when Robert was 15 and left him to provide for himself. About the years of drifting west, following cattle drives and seasonal work until he found himself in New Mexico territory and found that it suited something in him that Missouri had not quite addressed. About the profound and clarifying solitude of long cattle drives, nights under stars so dense they looked solid, days of riding through country that made you feel small but not insignificant small, the way a man feels small inside a great cathedral, appropriately scaled to something that matters. She listened to all of it and held it carefully, the way she held everything. One afternoon in mid-October, he arrived at the Brooks place to find her sitting on the front step with her hands clasped in her lap and a look on her face that he had not seen before. Not distress exactly, but something heavy and internal. He dismounted and tied the mare and sat down beside her on the step without asking what was wrong, just sitting close enough that she could feel he was there. After a while she said, "My father's health is worse than he's been letting on. He admitted it to me this morning. The doctor in Cimarron says his heart is weak." Robert was quiet. He knew better than to offer hollow reassurance. "He shouldn't be farming alone," she said. "Even with me here to help, the physical labor is too much for him. But he won't leave this land. I've seen men like him before. This land is who he is. Selling it or leaving it would finish him faster than any weak heart." "What does he need?" Robert asked. She turned her head to look at him. "Fewer things to do that are hard on the body, more things that are light on it. The garden he can manage, the smaller daily things, but the heavy work." She stopped. Robert looked out at the farm for a moment, thinking. "I've been saving," he said. "I've told you that. I've been saving toward something of my own. I don't have enough yet for full land of my own, but I have enough to—" He stopped and looked at her, and something careful and serious settled into the space between them. "Louise, I want to ask you something, and I want you to hear it as I mean it, which is not as something rushed or circumstantial, because what I feel is neither rushed nor circumstantial. It has been building since before I even met you, since a morning when I sat on a horse looking at a fence post and felt the world rearrange itself under me." She was very still. "I would like to ask your father for permission to court you formally," he said. "Not because I need his permission to feel what I feel, but because I respect him and I respect you, and I want everything between us to be done in the right way. And after that, if you will have me, I would like to marry you. Not because your father needs help with the farm, because I have never in my life wanted anything the way I want to spend my time in the same world you are in, every day, for as long as I get." The wind moved through the cottonwood trees along the creek. A chicken scratched in the dust nearby. Louise Brooks sat very still on the step of her father's house and looked at Robert Warren with her dark, steady, extraordinarily serious eyes. "You were going to ask my father," she said. "Yes." "Then ask him," she said, "and then come back and ask me too, because I am the one you are asking." He went inside and found Henry Brooks sitting by the window with a Bible open in his lap that he was not quite reading, and Henry listened to what Robert had to say with the careful attention of a man who has been thinking about this conversation for some time and has prepared himself for it. When Robert finished, Henry closed the Bible slowly and looked at his hands. "She is not an easy woman," Henry said at last. "No, sir," Robert agreed. "I know that. She has strong opinions and she will not abandon them because it would be more convenient for you. She has a temper when something is unjust, and she has a long memory, and she would rather do most things herself than ask for help." "I know," Robert said. "I have been paying attention." Henry looked up at him. "Those are also the best things about her." "I know that too," Robert said. Henry Brooks extended his hand, and Robert shook it, and neither man needed to say anything more because the handshake said it all. He went back outside and found Louise standing now at the garden gate, one hand on the post, looking toward the cottonwoods. She heard him come out and turned, and he walked up to her and stopped a foot away, close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. "Louise Brooks," he said, "will you marry me?" She held his gaze for a long, perfect, deeply serious moment. Then she put her hand against his chest, flat over his heart, and he felt his own heart beat loud and rapid under her palm. "Yes," she said. "Robert Warren, I will." He put his hand over hers, holding it there against his chest, and the afternoon light fell golden and warm across the Brooks homestead, and the creek ran steadily through the cottonwoods, and somewhere out on the Collier property road, a fence post stood in the dust with a name carved into it that had started everything. They were married in November of 1882, in the small church in Cimarron, on a clear, cold day when the sky was the particular deep blue that New Mexico saves for its best winter mornings. Louise wore a dress she had made herself from dark blue wool, because she was practical and she did not see the sense in a white dress in the New Mexico desert, and she looked extraordinary in it. Robert wore his best clothes, which were decent, and Del Carver stood up with him, and Martha, the postmistress who had set Robert on the path in the first place, sat in the third pew and cried quietly into her handkerchief. Henry Brooks walked his daughter down the short aisle with careful dignity, and when he placed her hand in Robert's, his eyes were bright but his voice was steady when he said, "Take good care of my girl." "I will," Robert said, and meant it with everything in him. The minister said the words, and Louise and Robert said the words back to him. And when it was done, Robert turned to his new wife, and she was looking at him with that expression that was serious and warm together, that expression that was entirely and irreducibly Louise, and he understood with absolute clarity that this was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and probably the best thing that ever would. There was a small celebration afterward at the Cimarron Hotel, where Caldwell and his wife had helped arrange a supper table, and the people of the small community gathered to eat and talk and wish the couple well. Del Carver drank too much and told a long, rambling, good-natured story about Robert losing a bet to a steer once that was only partially true, and Louise laughed for the first time in Robert's hearing with a full, unconstrained laugh, and he stored that sound away in the part of him that kept the things he could not afford to lose. They went home that night to the Brooks homestead, because that was where Henry was and where they would live for the time being, and Henry had thoughtfully made himself scarce by going to bed very early, and Louise and Robert sat by the small fire in the main room and talked quietly for a long time before they went to bed themselves, and the world outside was dark and cold and full of stars, and Robert thought he had never been so warm. The first months of marriage were the kind that teach you things about a person that you could not have learned any other way. Robert learned that Louise was right about most things and knew it, which was occasionally maddening and always admirable. He learned that she was fiercely protective of the people she loved, and that the list of people she loved was not long but was unassailable. He learned that she cried at unexpected things and not at expected ones, that she was moved by small acts of consideration and unmoved by grand gestures, that she hummed while she cooked and went entirely silent when she was very happy, the way some people go still in beautiful places as though sound might disturb them. Louise learned that Robert was steadier than the landscape he moved through, which was saying something. She learned that he had a sense of humor that was quiet and dry, and that she had to be paying attention to catch it, but that when she caught it, it was always worth catching. She learned that he could be stubborn in the specific way of people who have decided on a principle and will not be moved from it, and that this quality was inseparable from the integrity that she admired in him. She learned that he watched her when he thought she was not looking, with an expression of such straightforward tenderness that it made her feel simultaneously exposed and entirely safe. She learned that he meant every word he said, not in the sense that he was always right, but in the sense that he never said things for decoration. If Robert Warren said a thing, he had thought it through and decided it was worth saying. Spring came, and with it the possibility that Louise was carrying a child, which was confirmed by the doctor in Cimarron in March of 1883. She told Robert on the porch in the evening, the same porch where so much of their early courtship had played out, and he was so still for a moment after she told him that she worried she had startled him badly. Then he reached over and took both her hands in his and held them and said, "Louise, I want you to know that whatever you need, I will make sure you have it." "I need you not to treat me like glass," she said immediately. "I know," he said. "I know you well enough to know that." "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." They did. Henry Brooks received the news with a quiet, deep joy that softened everything in his face. The doctor had been direct with Louise in private about her father's heart. It was weak and growing weaker, and he could not predict how much time Henry had, but he counseled against heavy exertion and stress, and suggested that having something joyful to look forward to was not, medically speaking, a small thing. Louise carried that knowledge carefully, not hiding it from Robert but not burdening her father with it either, and she made sure that Henry had every joyful thing she could provide him. The summer of 1883 was hot and demanding, and Louise refused to allow it to slow her down more than strictly necessary, which frustrated Robert periodically, and which he had learned to express carefully and only once per concern, because saying a thing twice to Louise accomplished nothing except to make her more firmly committed to her original position. She was healthy and strong, and the pregnancy was uncomplicated, and she spent her energy on the garden, on preserving food for winter, on the correspondence she had begun with Mrs. Clara Ames back in St. Louis, who had become something of a mentor to her from a distance. Robert, meanwhile, had had a long conversation with Hector Grimes in the spring about his future. Grimes was not a bad man, if not a particularly warm one, and he respected Robert's work enough to listen with attention when Robert explained that he was married now and his wife's father was unwell, and he needed to be closer to home base than regular long cattle drives allowed. Grimes offered him a position as a year-round hand and foreman of the smaller operations nearer to Cimarron, which meant Robert could sleep in his own bed most nights. It was a reduction in certain freedoms but not in pay, and Robert took it gratefully. He was also saving with renewed discipline and purpose. He had spoken quietly with several people in the community about the land situation, and he had learned that a piece of property adjacent to the Brooks homestead, belonging to an elderly man named Gustavo Reyes who had farmed it poorly for years and was now too old to work it, might be available for purchase. He began conversations with Reyes through an intermediary, careful and patient, while saying nothing to Louise until he had something real to tell her. In August of 1883, Henry Brooks died. It was not sudden, in the sense that they had known it was coming, but it was swift at the end, a matter of 3 days between the worsening symptoms and the final morning when Louise sat beside her father's bed holding his hand, while the light came through the small window and Robert stood in the doorway, and Henry Brooks breathed his last breath with his daughter's hand in his, and what Louise would later describe as the most peaceful expression she had ever seen on a living face. She was quiet in her grief, which was the only way she knew to be in the face of enormous things. She did not collapse. She organized the arrangements with the same capable clarity she brought to everything, and she accepted the condolences of the community with grace, and she did not cry in front of anyone except Robert. And with Robert she cried entirely, deeply, for one long night while he held her and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say, and he understood that, and she needed him to understand it. She was 6 months along, and she carried her grief and her child together, and Robert thought that the courage required to do that was more than most people would ever be called upon to summon. They buried Henry Brooks in the small cemetery outside Cimarron, beside his wife Alina, and the community turned out in the way small Western communities do for their own, because whatever else the frontier was, it made people understand that they needed each other or they would not survive. 3 weeks after Henry died, Robert came home one evening and found Louise in the kitchen, and he sat down across from her at the table and put a document on the wood in front of her. She picked it up and read it carefully. It was a deed of purchase for the Ray's property, adjacent to the Brooks land, signed and registered. She set it down and looked at him. "You've been working on this for a while," she said. "Since April," he said. "I wanted to have something to tell you before I told you." She looked at the deed, then at him, then at the adobe walls of the house where she had grown up. "The two properties together," she said slowly, working it through. "The two properties together," he confirmed, "make a holding large enough to run a proper small cattle operation and still have land under cultivation. The Ray's land has better water access. Your father's land has the house and the barn. Together they make something neither of them was alone." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the evening wind moved through the cottonwood trees along the creek. "He would have liked this," she said. "My father, he would have liked knowing the land was going to grow." "I know," Robert said. "I thought about him when I was working on it." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Robert." "Yes." "You are a very good man," she said, in the direct and unembellished way she said things when she meant them most deeply. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. "I had good material to work with," he said. "You make me want to be." Their son was born in October of 1883, during a night of high wind that rattled the window shutters and moaned around the corners of the adobe house, as though the land itself were announcing something. He was a strong, healthy boy with Robert's coloring and Louise's expression, that look of alert, assessing calm that seemed to take in everything and give away nothing until he was ready. They named him Henry Robert Warren, for the grandfather he would not remember, and when Louise held him for the first time and looked down at his face, she wept without trying to stop herself, which was the second time Robert had seen her cry without restraint, and it undid him completely. He sat beside her on the bed, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her very carefully, because she was tired and new at this particular kind of holding, and little Henry Robert Warren slept in her arms with the profound, unconscious trust of a creature who has just arrived in the world and has already decided it is adequate. "Hello, Henry," Louise said quietly to her son. "Your grandfather would have thought the world of you. I intend to make sure you know about him." Robert pressed his lips to the top of her head and said nothing, because nothing was needed. The years that followed were full years, the kind that seem in retrospect to have been lived in twice the usual density. They were not easy years in the way that fairy tales are easy, because New Mexico Territory in the 1880s was not a fairy tale landscape. It was a landscape of sustained effort, of weather that did not negotiate, of markets that shifted and prices that fluctuated, and the constant, patient, demanding work of building something on land that made you earn every bit of it. Robert expanded the cattle operation gradually, buying stock carefully with money they had saved and reinvested. He hired 2 hands by 1885, men he chose with deliberate care, because he knew from his own years of working for other men what it meant to have an employer who was fair and what it meant to have one who was not. He paid decent wages and expected decent work, and the arrangement was productive and relatively harmonious. Louise ran the household and the kitchen garden and, increasingly, the books of the operation, because she had a head for numbers that was sharply better than Robert's, a fact he acknowledged without embarrassment the first time she pointed out an error in his accounting that had been costing them money for 2 months. "I should have been doing this from the start," she said, not accusingly, just as a plain statement of fact. Yes, he agreed, equally plainly. From now on, you do. She took over the books, and the operation became visibly more efficient within a season, which Robert reported to Del Carver one Saturday in Cimarron with a pride so undisguised that Del laughed at him for 5 minutes. "You are the most shameless, proud husband I have ever encountered," Del said. "She is extraordinary," Robert said, utterly unashamed. Del shook his head, but he was smiling. "You really did ride 12 miles into the desert because of a name on a fence post." "Best thing I ever did," Robert said. "Agree," Del said, and drank his coffee. The territory was changing around them, as territories do. The railroad had reached into more and more of New Mexico, opening markets that had been distant or inaccessible. Towns were growing and filling in, and the open range that had been the rule of the early decades was giving way to fenced and deeded land. There were conflicts over this, as there always are when the rules of a place are rewritten, and Robert navigated them with the same steadiness he brought to everything. There was also the question of the Apache people who had lived in this country far longer than anyone Robert knew, and whose circumstances by the mid-1880s were a story of tremendous injustice that no one in the region could entirely avoid confronting. Robert had been in New Mexico long enough to have formed views on this that were, by the standards of the time and place, relatively thoughtful. He had traded with Apache individuals at fairs and markets, and he had observed enough to understand that the displacement of indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands was not something to celebrate, regardless of what the newspapers in Santa Fe printed. He said as much when the subject arose, plainly and without elaboration, which earned him some sideways looks and also the respect of several people whose respect was worth having. Louise shared these views with a depth that surprised even Robert when the subject first came up between them. "The land was theirs before it was anyone else's," she said simply, sitting at the kitchen table one evening when a traveling man had stopped to share supper, and the conversation had gone in that direction. "All the legal papers in the world don't change what was true before the papers." The traveling man, who had held some opinions of the contrary variety, had found himself addressed by a woman who knew the history and the geography and the specific administrative decisions better than he did. Stated clearly, and without the social softening, most women of the era were expected to apply to contentious subjects, and he had left that supper table considerably quieter than he had arrived. Robert had caught Louise's eye across the table and said nothing, but his expression said everything, and she had pressed her lips together over a smile that she released only after the traveling man was out of earshot. In 1886, Louise found out she was carrying their second child. This news came during a summer that was drier than usual, which was saying something in that country, and the creek ran lower than either Robert or Louise had seen it, and they spent considerable energy and ingenuity managing the water access for both the livestock and the garden. It was not the easiest context in which to add another member to the family, but Louise took the view that children arrived on their own schedule, and the world's logistics simply had to accommodate. Their daughter was born in February of 1887, during a winter cold snap that frosted the inside of the windows. She was smaller than Henry Robert had been and louder almost immediately, with a voice that clearly intended to be heard, and a pair of dark eyes identical to her mother's. They named her Eleanor for Louise's mother, and the name settled over the baby with the weight of something that fit. Henry Robert, who was 3 and already clearly his mother's son in the manner of his thinking, careful, direct, unhurried, regarded his new sister with serious interest, and then, at Louise's encouragement, reached out and very gently touched her hand with one finger. Eleanor wrapped her fingers around his with the blind, powerful grip of the newborn, and Henry Robert looked up at his mother with an expression of profound and astonished gravity. "She is very strong," he said. "She is," Louise agreed. "Like you," Henry Robert said. Louise laughed, surprised, and Robert, standing in the doorway, laughed too. And the sound of the two of them laughing together in the bedroom where Louise Brooks Warren had just arrived in the world was one of those moments that Robert tucked away in the permanent part of himself, the part that was not subject to the weather or the market or the demands of the land. The operation grew steadily through the late 1880s. By 1888, Robert employed 3 hands year-round, and Louise had extended the kitchen garden into a small market garden, selling produce to Caldwell's store and to the hotel in Cimarron. They were not wealthy, but they were solid, and solid was a thing that felt enormous when you remembered where you had started. Del Carver, who had retired from Grimes' operation by 1887, came to live in a small room off the barn that they offered him without fuss, presented simply as a practical matter, because there was space, and he was old, and the winters were cold. Del accepted with equal lack of fuss, and spent his days doing whatever light tasks were available to him, and playing cards with Henry Robert in the evenings, and the arrangement suited everyone. Del died in the winter of 1889, quietly, in his sleep, which was the kind of death that made the people who learned of it say that he had deserved it. Robert found him in the morning and stood in the doorway of the small room for a moment with his hat in his hand, and felt the loss of the man in the specific and irreplaceable way that you feel the loss of someone who has been steady in your life for a long time. He had been Robert's oldest friend in this country, and his kindness had been the practical, undemonstrative kind that left tracks in the world without calling attention to itself. They buried him in the Cimarron cemetery, and Robert said the words at the graveside because he could not find a minister on short notice, and he said them well, because he had thought them through the night before, sitting up late while Louise slept, and he had found the real things he wanted to say and stripped away everything that was not true. The 1890s came, and with them the continuing transformation of New Mexico territory. Cimarron itself had changed, filled in with more commerce and more people, and the open-range days were truly over. It was a different country than the one Robert had first ridden into in the late 1870s, and he sometimes stood on the high ground above the Brooks Warren property and looked out over it, and tried to reconcile the landscape of now with the landscape of then, and found that they were both real simultaneously, layered on top of each other like the strata of the creek banks. Henry Robert was 8 years old in 1891, and showed every sign of becoming the kind of person who is genuinely interested in everything, which Robert found delightful and Louise found quietly gratifying. He was reading well, Louise's doing, and he peppered Del Carver with questions, and after Del's death peppered Robert and Louise and anyone else available, about everything from the mechanics of windmill pumps to the history of the Mexican land grants that underlay many of the property disputes in the region. Eleanor was 4 in 1891 and was, as Henry Robert had announced at her birth, very strong. She had also developed a personality of such vivid and immediate expressiveness that spending time in her company was like spending time with a small, extremely well-reasoned thunderstorm. She had Louise's directness and Robert's steadiness, and some quality of her own that was entirely Eleanor, and she was the delight of both her parents and the devoted, somewhat bossed-around companion of her brother. Louise, in 1891, was 31 years old and was the version of herself that she had been working toward for more than a decade, not a finished version, because she held the intelligent person's understanding that there is no finished version, but a version that was fully inhabited and fully hers. She was involved in the affairs of the Cimarron community in ways that went beyond the social obligations of a rancher's wife. She was a voice in discussions about the school and its funding. She had corresponded with the territorial government on matters of land and water rights. She was listened to in those discussions, not always easily or without friction, but listened to because she was invariably well-informed and invariably reasonable and invariably correct often enough to have earned the room's attention. Robert, watching her in those years, never stopped being astonished by her. This was not a passive astonishment, not the astonishment of a man who has been lucky and knows it in an abstract way. It was an active, specific, ongoing astonishment at the particular details of who she was, the way she read at the kitchen table in the lamplight with absolute absorption, the way she argued with the county assessor about the Rialto water rights in a voice that was perfectly level and 10 times more devastating for its levelness, the way she put her hand against his chest sometimes in the dark, the same gesture she had made the afternoon she agreed to marry him. And he felt then exactly what he had felt then, the enormous steady knocking of his own heart under her hand. They did not live in the absence of difficulty. The drought year of 1893 cost them stock and revenue, and required the drawing down of savings they had spent years building, and there were hard conversations at the kitchen table that winter about what they could sustain and what they had to release. They had those conversations as they had all hard conversations, honestly and without the theatrical anger that comes from feeling alone in difficulty. They were not alone in it. They were in it together, which made it bearable and eventually navigable. A third child came in the spring of 1894, another boy. They named him James, for no particular historical reason, but because it was a name they both simply liked, which Louise said was perfectly sufficient reason for a name. James arrived with the robust, uncomplicated health of a person who has decided, at the very start, to thrive, and he was crawling with aggressive determination by the time he was 6 months old and walking, or more accurately, charging, by the time he was 10 months old, which caused Robert to describe him at supper one evening as the most purposeful human being I have ever encountered, including myself. Louise had looked at James, who was at that moment eating a piece of cornbread with the focused intensity of someone diffusing something explosive, and said, "He gets it from you." "He gets it from you," Robert said. "No," she said, looking at Robert with that warm, direct gaze that still, after 12 years of marriage, made him feel like the sun had come out from behind a cloud directly above him. "He gets it from you. You are the most purposeful person I know, Robert Warren. You always have been. You rode 12 miles into the desert because of a name in the dust, and you meant every step of it." He looked at her across the supper table in the lamplight of the home they had built together, with Henry Robert doing arithmetic in the corner and Alina arranging something elaborate on the floor that involved every wooden spoon in the house, and James working on his cornbread with the dedication of a man with a mission, and Del Carver's empty chair that was still in the room, because none of them had moved it, and the books on the shelf that Louise had accumulated over the years, and the window that looked out onto the property that their work had shaped, all the way to the line of cottonwoods along the Rialto Creek. "I would ride it again," he said, "every mile of it." She smiled at him with the full, unguarded smile that he had loved from the first time he saw it, and reached across the table to touch his hand, and Henry Robert looked up from his arithmetic and made a face, and Alina said, "What?" And James put down his cornbread and looked at all of them with alert, wide-eyed interest. There was, in that ordinary kitchen on that ordinary evening, a life so full and so genuinely his own that Robert Warren felt it as an almost physical weight, the good kind, the kind that anchors you in yourself and to the people and the place you belong to. The years moved forward with the particular texture of lives that are fully lived, the months distinguishable by their work and their weather, and the small events that accumulate into a family's private history. Henry Robert, by the age of 12, had become his mother's student in the reading and studying she had always done, and he developed an interest in the law and in the governance of territories that Louise nurtured with books ordered through Caldwell's store and correspondence with a schoolmaster in Santa Fe, who was kind enough to reply with recommended reading lists. Alina at 9 was already the person who fixed things, not just physically, though she had a gift for that, could diagnose a wagon wheel problem or a fence post issue with a quick assessing look, but socially. She was the child who noticed when someone was left out and did something about it. The child who knew before anyone else said anything that James was getting a cold. The child who appeared at her father's elbow sometimes when he was working through a problem and said, without preamble, "Have you tried it the other way?" And usually the other way was better. James was everything they had seen in him from the beginning, purposeful and physical and entirely at home in the landscape, in a way that his older siblings, who were more their mother's children in temperament, were not in quite the same way. He rode early and rode well, took to the cattle work with an instinctive ease that Robert recognized from his own youth, and could be found at almost any hour either doing something useful or preparing to do something useful, which was all you could ask of any person. In 1896, Louise organized the Cimarron women to petition the territorial government for funding for a proper school building, to replace the one-room arrangement that had been serving the community's children for years. It was not an instantaneous success, because the territorial government of New Mexico in 1896 was not an institution renowned for its responsiveness to petitions. But Louise was constitutionally unsuited to being discouraged by the slowness of official processes, and she maintained the correspondence over 18 months until the funding was allocated and the building was built. On the day the school opened, a crisp October morning in 1897, with the smell of fresh-cut wood still strong inside the new building, Robert stood in the back of the gathered crowd and watched Louise stand at the front and speak about what it meant for the children of this community to have a proper place to learn. She spoke simply and without performance, which was the only way she spoke, and what she said was true and it mattered, and the people listening knew it. He watched her from the back of the crowd, this woman he had found through a name in the dust on a leaning fence post 15 years ago. This woman who had handed him a tin cup of water on a hot afternoon and looked at him with those dark, evaluating eyes. This woman who had said yes to him on a porch in the October light while putting her hand against his chest over his heart. This woman who had grieved her father and raised 3 children and built a life and a community simultaneously. And he felt what he had felt that first morning at the fence post, that enormous, inexplicable, chest-caving thing. And now he knew exactly what it was called and exactly where it lived and exactly what it had been leading him toward all along. He was 41 years old and she was 37, and they were, he thought, in the best years of their life together. Not because the difficult things were behind them, because they were not all behind them and never would be. This was New Mexico territory, and the world was not inclined to run out of difficult things. But because they had built something between them that was strong enough to hold whatever came, and they both knew it, and that knowledge was the foundation of everything. After the school dedication, walking home through the Cimarron streets in the clear October afternoon with his wife beside him and James running ahead and Alina walking with her characteristic purposeful pace, and Henry Robert engaged in what appeared to be a significant internal debate with himself, Robert reached over and took Louise's hand. She looked at him sideways. "What is it?" she said. "Nothing specific," he said. "Everything general." She squeezed his hand once, firmly, which was Louise for volumes of feeling compressed into a single gesture. They walked on through the bright afternoon, and the land spread out around them in all directions, and somewhere south and east of town, an old fence post stood at the edge of what had once been the Collier property, leaning at its perpetual angle, the name carved into it softened further by years of weather but not gone. Still there in the wood, Louise Brooks, like the beginning of a sentence that the world had taken 15 years to finish, and had finished exactly right. New Mexico Territory became the state of New Mexico in 1912, the year Robert turned 56 and Louise turned 52. By then Henry Robert Warren was 28 years old and practicing law in Santa Fe, having managed through a combination of his mother's correspondence, his own persistent intelligence, and the sponsorship of a sympathetic territorial judge named Montoya to read law in the proper way and pass the bar. He had married a woman named Clara Sandoval the year before, a schoolteacher from Las Vegas, New Mexico, and they were expecting their first child by the time statehood arrived. Alina was 24 and had been running the ranch alongside her parents for 3 years, since her father's knee had been badly injured in a fall from a horse in 1909, an injury that had healed imperfectly and left him with a pronounced limp and a reduced capacity for the physical demands of the work. Alina had stepped into that reduction without discussion, simply filling the space that needed filling, because that was Alina. She was not married, not because no one had asked men had asked, but because the men who had asked had, upon closer examination, been revealed to be men who wanted to marry Alina Warren's energy and capability, while expecting that energy and capability to be redirected away from the ranch and toward their households. And Alina had evaluated each situation with the clear eyes her mother had given her, and declined without rancor, and returned to her work. She would, in the fullness of time, meet a man named Torres, a surveyor from Mora who came through the ranch in 1913 to work on the boundary mapping that statehood necessitated, who understood from their first 3 conversations that Alina Warren was a whole and complete person who happened to also have room in her life for another person, and who found that understanding not complicated but refreshing. But that was still ahead of them. James Warren was 17 in 1900, and in 1912 he was 29, married to a woman named Rebecca who had come west from Kentucky with her family, and they had 2 small children of their own and were running a ranch 50 miles to the west near Springer, New Mexico. James had left home at 22 with his parents' blessing and their careful advice, and a small portion of money they had set aside for him, and he had built his own operation with the same purposeful energy that had driven him since the cornbread days of infancy. Robert and Louise's lives in those years had a quality of rich complexity, the complexity of lives that have produced other lives and watched those lives go out into the world and do things. They were still on the property along the Rayado Creek. They had improved the house significantly over the years, adding rooms as the children required them and retaining them as the children left. The kitchen was larger. There was a proper parlor now, with books along 2 walls, Louise's books, accumulated over 3 decades of ordering and reading, and refusing to get rid of anything worth reading a second time. Robert's knee bothered him in cold weather and he used a cane when the terrain required it, which he did without particular complaint except on the days when it was very bad. And on those days Louise brought him strong coffee and sat with him and they talked about things, the old days, the changes in the country, the children, whatever had happened that week, in the easy, shorthand way of people who have been talking for 30 years and no longer need full sentences because the full sentences are implied by the shorthand. They were still in love. It was not the same love as the Porch in October love of 1882, but it was built on that love the way a house is built on a foundation, and it was warmer and more layered and more interesting, because they were warmer and more layered and more interesting than they had been, and the love had grown with them. On a morning in the spring of 1913, 31 years after Robert Warren had first sat on his roan mare and stared at a fence post, Louise said at breakfast that she wanted to ride out to the south. Robert looked up from his coffee. "The south," he said. "I want to see if that fence post is still standing," she said. He looked at her for a moment, this woman across the breakfast table, this woman who was 53 years old with gray threading through her dark hair and lines at the corners of her dark eyes that were the record of decades of squinting into New Mexico light and decades of laughing, often at him and often with him, and often at life in general because it had given her so much to laugh about along with everything else. "You think it's still standing," he said. "Only one way to know," she said. Alina had the horses saddled within the hour, and the 3 of them rode out, Alina a respectful distance behind, understanding without being told that this was her parents' errand through the spring morning, through the scrubland and the sage, past the old Pedersen Road, and toward the south end of what had once been the Collier property, now subdivided and partially farmed. The fence line was mostly gone. Most of the posts had fallen, and the wire between them had rusted and collapsed into the ground, and in some places been removed entirely. But one section of the original fence still stood, or nearly stood, several posts in a row listing at various angles, weathered gray beyond gray, ancient and stubborn. Robert pulled his horse to a stop and Louise pulled up beside him, and they sat in the spring morning looking at the fence. "Which one?" he said. She looked for a moment, then pointed. "Third from the right, leaning at a sharp angle, cracked halfway through, hanging by the determination of the wood grain and nothing else." He walked his horse forward slowly until they were alongside it. He looked down at the post. The carving was still there. Decades of wind and weather had softened it, worn the edges of the letters down, bleached the wood around it to silver, but the letters were there. He could read them still, if he knew what he was looking for. Louise Brooks. He sat on his horse and looked at it for a long time, and felt what he had felt the first morning, the chest-caving thing that had set everything in motion, translated now into something so rich and so layered and so full that it had no name because it was too large for one name. It was 31 years of name. It was all of it simultaneously. He looked over at Louise, who was looking at the post with an expression he could not entirely read, something private and large and, he thought, deeply satisfied. She turned and caught him looking at her, and they looked at each other in the spring morning of 1913 above an old fence post in the New Mexico scrubland. And there was no need for any of them to say anything because the whole story was right there between them, legible as the carving in the wood, as clear as the sky above them, as permanent as the mountains to the west. Then Louise did something he had not quite expected. She dismounted, which took her a moment and the assistance of a nearby rock, and she stood before the old post, and she put her hand on it, flat-palmed, the way she put her hand on things she wanted to understand. Then she reached into the pocket of her riding coat and drew out what was, Robert realized with a start of recognition, a small folding knife, old and well used. She opened the blade and began to carve carefully below the old letters. Robert watched from horseback, leaning forward slightly on the pommel. Elena, from her respectful distance, watched too. When Louise stepped back, below the old weathered letters of her maiden name, in fresher cuts that would fade to match over time, were the words Robert Warren. She folded the knife and put it back in her pocket and looked at the post for a moment, then looked up at him. "There," she said. "Now it's right." He sat on his horse in the spring morning of 1913 and looked at his name beside hers in the wood of an old fence post that had been standing in the New Mexico desert for longer than either of them had known each other, and he felt the entire span of it. The morning he had first stopped, the Sunday rides to her father's homestead, the porch in October, the church in Cimarron in November, the children and the years and the work and the life, all of it, every mile. And he thought of all the mornings that had come and would come, and he thought of the woman standing in front of that fence post who had put his name beside hers in the wood of it, and he thought there had never been a better thing in this world than what they had made together, starting from a name in the dust and a feeling he could not explain. He dismounted slowly, because his knee was what it was, and he walked the 2 steps to where she stood, and she turned to look at him, and he put his hands on either side of her face very gently, the way you hold something that matters enormously, and he kissed her in the spring morning with all of it in him, all 31 years, and she put her arms around him and held on. And Elena Warren, from her respectful distance, looked away at the sky and smiled to herself. The fence post stood behind them, holding both names, in the dust and the light and the wind of the open country where it had always stood, doing the work it had always been doing, the work of being a place where someone left something permanent, and someone else came looking and found more than they had known to look for. They rode home through the morning, all 3 of them, and Elena ranged ahead on her sure-footed horse while Robert and Louise rode side by side through the sage and the spring light, talking about nothing important and everything that mattered, the way they had always talked, the way they would always talk, as long as the country gave them days to do it in. When they got back to the homestead, there was a letter from Henry Robert on the hall table, delivered that morning, announcing that Clara had given birth to a son 3 days previous, healthy and loud and named. Henry Robert's letter said with a pride that came through every careful word, after his grandfather, Henry Brooks Warren II, new to the world, just arrived in the spring of 1913 with everything still ahead of him. Louise read the letter standing in the hallway and then handed it to Robert without a word, and he read it and looked up at her, and she was smiling, that full, unguarded smile, with her dark eyes bright and her whole self lit up with the news, and he could not say it better than he had said it 100 times in 100 ways and always meant it and always would, so he said the simplest version of it, which was the truest. "I love you, Louise." She stepped forward and put her hand against his chest, flat over his heart, that same gesture, that first gesture, the one that had never stopped meaning everything. "I love you, Robert," she said. "I have since before I knew I did." And in the house along the Rayado Creek, in the territory that had become a state, in the spring that had come around again as it always came around, in the life they had spent 31 years building together out of good intentions and hard work, and a name written in the dust on an old fence post by a young woman who did not yet know who she was going to be. The answer to every question either of them had ever had about this was present, wholly and completely, in the solid, sufficient, irreplaceable fact of each other. Outside, the cottonwood trees along the creek were coming into their spring green, and the sky was the deep, particular, astonishing blue of a New Mexico morning. And somewhere a hawk turned on a current of air above the property, rising, and the land stretched out in all directions, vast and old and indifferent and beautiful. And on a fence post south of town 2 names stood together in the weathered wood, new beside old, as clear and as permanent as everything that had begun with one and grown into both.